Southwestern Illinois College, and I'm super excited for this first ever presentation of Beat Loops and You, or Combined Electronics and Classical, big heavy quotes on that by the way, Classical Instruments 101. So a little bit more about me and how I've worked with electronics in the past. I have started working with electronics maybe within the last 2 or 3 years. I definitely still feel like a beginner in a lot of different ways, but I think I've finally come to the point where I know what I want to execute. I know what resources that I need to look for when I don't have the answer, and enough to share information with other people. The goal of this presentation in particular is to give you, as musicians or potential music makers, if you don't already play or sing anything, give you a good foundation of things to know when you're considering working with electronics. A lot of these different points are things I wish that I personally knew when I was starting, or things that I found to be really, really crucial. Now, here's the big first question. Why? What do I have to gain when I'm working with electronics, or even just considering, toying around with them? Well, there's actually a few really good things that can come out of working with electronics. One big thing is that you can explore a lot of different capabilities of your instrument and just music making as a whole. Now, this concept isn't particularly new. You have a lot of composers like Penderecki and Berio, where they set out to create works that push instruments or vocalists to just kind of the extremes of their playing. I can speak especially for Berio, as he has a series of pieces called the sequenzas, in which he makes the instrumentalist, or in one sequenza, a vocalist, just perform at extremes of the range of their instrument or vocal capabilities, or doing extended techniques, or also known as more unconventional ways of playing your instrument. An example of that would maybe be singing through your instrument, also referred to as multiphonics, or doing maybe different types of articulations, such as a slap tongue. Now, when you're using electronics, you're essentially doing the same thing as these composers set out to do. You're trying to find new ways that you can play your instrument and new mediums to discover with this. You have a whole new soundscape that you're working with, and it can be really, really fun and really, really rewarding. Now, another thing that electronics can bring to your performance is it actually solidifies a lot of fundamentals of your music making. You can see this through a couple of different examples. One in particular is that if you're using, say, a backing track and you're playing along with it. Now, when you have a pianist as your accompanist and you say, skip a line of music, or you're slowing down the tempo, if your pianist is well-trained, they'll be able to find where you're at and catch up with you. However, with a backing track, you do not receive this grace. It is literally a robot. It does not care if you're missing rhythms or skipping ahead. It's just going to keep going and leave you in the dust. It forces you as the musician, where you have to be really on top of your rhythm, on top of your tempo, just making sure you're keeping aware of where you are within the music, even more than usual. Another way that you can find how these fundamentals play a crucial role in your electronics performance is, say, you're using a loop pedal. Now, for those of you who don't know what a loop pedal is, how many of you know Ed Sheeran? That's it. Oh, there we go, we got more hands there. So he tends to use a loop pedal, actually, in a lot of his live performances, where he just, has a pedal board down here, plays a line of music, and then has it go on repeat over and over again. He also adds a lot of these counter melodies and a lot of harmonies to just create this whole one-person band. Now, when you're playing your own melodies, your own instrument, you have to really keep in mind with that one bass loop that keeps going and going. You have to make sure you're matching your intonation to that loop. You have to be right on point with the articulations and the styles. So it really gives you a way to listen to music where, you're using the same skill set in a choir, in a concert band, in a chamber group, but you're exercising it in a whole new way. Last but not least, honestly, playing with electronics is pretty cool. I have found a lot of repertoire where it just, samples all sorts of things from pop culture or using certain synthesizer noises that I found to be just really gratifying for my own purposes. All right, so we know that there's validity to playing with electronics. Here's the next big question. What's stopping you? When I talk to other musicians that have maybe talked about interested in electronics, sometimes they run into a few roadblocks along the way. So here are a few of the more common ones that I've found in talking to other people. First of all, I don't know how to work with electronics. Like, this seems like rocket science to me. There's just so much, it's paralyzing. I don't know where to start. Well, I was in the same place about 3 years ago, just a total noob, so to speak, with working with electronics. And you can really use a lot of resources that are out there. I know for me personally, I have been asking a lot of different people, just, some tricks, some pointers. The audio engineer that is so greatly assisting me in the back, Dan McCoy, I have definitely bugged him for a lot of different things about electronics, so he can vouch for that for sure. So just having a lot of people, I'm really fortunate too with my day job as a clarinetist with the Band of Mid-America. I'm surrounded by a lot of really awesome musicians with really just varied skill sets, some into electronics as well. I understand though that not everyone is as fortunate to know a lot of people that work with these electronics. So here's where the age of the internet comes in handy. YouTube. So YouTube is an absolute godsend in the way that it provides a lot of tutorials that other people have shared. So whether you're working with something like GarageBand or a guitar pedal, I'm sure that you can find some sort of tutorial or otherwise informational video on this. I actually tested this theory the other day too, just to make sure that I'm not, giving you faulty advice. And so I found out some new information about working with electronics, specifically to clarinet. In the same way that a guitar has a pickup, the wire that you just plug into it, apparently they have made a clarinet barrel. This part of the clarinet right here, they have created a clarinet barrel that has its own pickup. So it picks up a lot more of the sound than you would if you're just trying to mic it. So even I'm learning new stuff as we go. So, next point that might be stopping you from working with electronics. Practicing it and playing it seems really scary. Like, I have this base knowledge right here, so I know kind of the ins and outs of it a little bit more, but it just, again, seems like rocket science. It's a totally new medium that, I have no idea what I'm doing. Well, that's all right. I was there too. But we'll take a look in just a second on some really good ways that you can practice efficiently and practice smart. Now here's a big one that stops a lot of people. Am I allowed to play this type of music as a classical musician? I'm here to tell you that's not a rule. You have made that rule up in your head. That doesn't happen. So as musicians, as many of you I know are from Mr. Jacobs' band class in here, or otherwise music majors, or have been music majors. As musicians learning in school, we're required to know the ins and outs and just a base fundamental of our instruments or our voice, and we have to have a really good working repertoire. This is super important. I definitely want to hammer in this point that you need to know a lot of your basics with your instrument, with music, with what you're studying and setting out to do. But in the same vein, don't let this stop you from going out and exploring different musical styles. You can even expand this beyond electronics. So whether you're looking to play with electronics as a clarinetist, or you want to be a jazz violin player, or heck, if you want to play hip-hop oboe, who am I to stop you? The sky's the limit as long as you've still got that base foundation, and you can just do anything that you want to set yourself to do. So now, we're going to talk, now that we know that we can do it, now that we know that, the few roadblocks that we know how to kind of work around those, let's talk a little bit about the different types of electronic music that's out there. So these can be divided into two categories. First off, we have live electronics, which is essentially special effects on your instrument. The improvisation that I played before starting this presentation is an example of that. what I was doing, and you can actually go to the second point on that, is I was using a computer program called Ableton. And I understand that we actually have a lot of computers in the department with Ableton, so all of you students out there, here's your opportunity to work with some really good software. Another way that one can work with live electronics is that you can use any sort of pedals like a guitarist would use, like a delay pedal or a distortion pedal or really anything of that vein. The cool thing with those guitar pedals is that they're not strictly guitar pedals. You can actually put any sort of input, whether it's an instrument or a microphone, and you'll be able to use those same effects on your instrument and your voice. So let's flip to the last page of your handout. You have a diagram right here that shows you just kind of what a basic setup would look like for both live, and we'll get to the other fixed electronics in just a second. So what you want to use live electronics is you've got your microphone, or if you've got a guitar or another instrument with a pickup, it might be an instrument instead. It will go straight into that pedal or a digital audio workstation, so Ableton, GarageBand, any sort of program that processes that sound. And then you'll have your output, which is your speaker system. All right, flipping back to the other portion, and the other type of electronics is fixed electronics. All right, show of hands again. How many of you have done karaoke at some point in your life? Congratulations, you have already worked with fixed electronics. Woohoo! Excellent. So, like it kind of lends itself to fixed electronics, you are essentially working with a backing track. So all of these electronic noises or sounds or what have you, they've already been kind of predetermined, and you're just playing along with them. And it's usually pretty easy to use. Basically, you'll just press play, and then you'll go play. A little bit easier than sometimes fiddling with some of those guitar or, I guess, instrument pedals. Going back to our handout, the layout is a little bit more complicated, especially if you are amplifying your instrument. So you will most likely need a soundboard if you don't have a sort of two-channel sort of thing for your audio source. So you've got a microphone that goes straight into the soundboard, maybe an instrument instead if you can just plug in a guitar. Then you also have your audio source that contains the backing track. So a computer, a phone, CD player, tape deck, 8-track, what have you. And then that soundboard will go straight into the speaker again. All right, does anyone have any questions about those first 3 sections? All right, we'll have some time at questions at the end if you want to still keep thinking about what to ask. So now, we know that we can play with electronics. We know we have the capability as ourselves, the performer, to play with electronics. And we know a few different types of things that are out there to kind of work with and maybe focus on. So now we're going to get into those good practice habits and how to really prepare that piece for your performance. The biggest point that I want to really emphasize here is that all good practice habits and elements of playing apply when you are working with electronics. This means that when you are working with this piece or this song, you want to make sure you're practicing it slowly, you're practicing it in different smaller chunks, and you're still keeping a good sound, a good tempo, just anything that you would need to play when you're playing without electronics. One really good thing to just kind of keep in mind alongside that is that your electronics, they should be enhancing your performance. You don't want to be that person where they've only got the novelty aspect, or maybe playing with a pedal, but they don't have a lot of substance. You don't want your electronics to be carrying you. You want it to enhance your performance and make it just that much better. Another important thing that goes along with good practice habits is to record yourself and have other people listen to you. Just like with non-electronics practicing, this is a super important thing to make sure your fundamentals are there. But you also want to make sure that at the same time you're listening for a few different things, whether it's the amount of effects that you're putting onto maybe your live electronics, or even the balance of your live instrument versus the back-end track that you have. So a few more things in addition to those fundamentals to listen to. Now there are a couple of things in terms of practicing that apply strictly to live electronics. It is timing. Timing is a big one for me personally, and for anyone that else has worked with live electronics. that's something that is really crucial to them as well. So with live electronics, like I was saying with some of the guitar pedal stuff earlier, is that sometimes you'll have to press certain buttons at certain times to trigger effects. And sometimes that can be a little bit hard to coordinate at first. One thing that can be really helpful with this is that you can take away the actual performance element and just practice the order in which you're pressing your buttons, or maybe if you're working with like a loop pedal, just counting the beats that you would want that loop to be, and just seeing if you can practice that element. Once you have that mastered, working in your prepared material will be that much easier. With my loop setup that I have back here, the Electro Harmonix 45000 actually has a built-in click track, which I have found to be really, really helpful in my own performances. If you come to the recital later tonight at 7, you'll see me just donning those headphones, and for a good portion of that particular piece, I'll have that click track going just to keep my tempo really, really strict. Another thing to keep in mind when you are working with live electronics is you want to check the level of your instruments and its effects. So you want to use extremes in your louds and your softs. You want to use long sustain tones as well as a lot of fluttering, 16th notes, flourishes of notes. Because depending on what you're using for that live effect, if you, in performance, which, live electronics, fixed electronics, no electronics, that adrenaline's going to keep pumping, and sometimes you just tend to do weird things in performance. So if you test those extremes of your instrument where you know you physically can get louder or softer or quicker or slower, then that'll keep your electronics in check and things won't go haywire in the process. Now, with fixed electronics, you want to make sure that you're spending plenty of time both with and without the backing track. So I, from personal experience, have found myself in the trap sometimes of practicing too much with that backing track. And although it's really good when you're trying to stay with that and get used to just how it feels, get used to hearing those visual cues, sometimes you find yourself, the fundamentals of your playing tend to go away and you get sucked into that backing track. For me personally, I know sometimes I don't always use the best sound, or I'm not using necessarily the most musical phrasing in that. So you want to make sure that you're taking time, stepping away from that track, and really just focusing on a few of those spots where it's easy to fall into that track. On the other hand, if you don't spend enough time with that backing track, then you might find you're not as used to it. Maybe there's some cues that you miss or things that you don't expect. For each person, it's going to be a different, happy medium spot in terms of using the backing track and not using that backing track. So keep those two extremes in mind as you're preparing your piece. With fixed electronics as well, many composers, if you're playing someone else's piece, many composers are nice enough to give you a lot of just kind of aural cues. Maybe, whirring noise right here before this section, or you hear ding dong, there's a doorbell or something like that. So it gives you a good starting point into where you should be in your piece. But one thing that's especially important as you're practicing it is to write timestamps. So this might mean just taking a second, just having your computer or whatever output you have, having your piece of music you're working on, and at the beginning of each new section or new mood, just writing in, taking a look at your computer or audio source. Oh, this happens at 1 minute and 40 seconds. That way you're able to take your audio source, and if you have to focus on a particular section with that backing track, you're able to start right there instead of just starting from the beginning of that piece each time. All right, so here's where we're at with playing electronics. We know that we can do it. We know that it's a valid thing to do. We know how to practice it, and we know what's out there. Congratulations, everyone. You've made it to performance time. But we're not done yet. There's still things to consider as you're playing this music in front of an audience. One of my coworkers has hammered in a rule that I have kept with me the whole time I'm working with electronics. It is using the 10% rule. Always be 10% smarter than the technology you're working with. And this means asking yourself questions such as, where is my input on my meter? Where is my output? What types of wires, plugs, etc. will I need? If you go back to the last page of your handout, there are a couple of common wires that you might find yourself encountering. encountering when you're working with your technology. The first one on the left is XLR, or also referred to as mic cables. You find these commonly going in and out of microphones, out of the boards, and out of speakers. To the right of that is also a couple of different similar types. You have a 1/4-inch jack, which will plug into instruments and will also serve as inputs and outputs sometimes. One really important thing for the 1/4-inch that you want to be really, really careful of is that there are two different types. You have balanced and you have unbalanced. Make sure you research your equipment and know exactly which type you want. The way you can tell the difference is that balanced and unbalanced, there will be a different number of rings on that particular input jack. Now with the 1/8-inch, that's your headphone jack. That's probably pretty common you would see if you're going into an audio source. Another way you can implement that 10% rule in your performance time is to create a diagram of your setup. And before you even are going and packing up for your performance, take apart your entire setup and then put it back together. That's going to save you a lot of time in performance. So that way you can find out what things you might not be as comfortable with, anything you might need to troubleshoot before the performance, and you'll be able to focus more on your actual playing when performance time hits. When you're using a microphone as well, include finding the best mic placement and knowing why it's the best mic placement as part of your process for this setting up. One of my other friends who works a lot with live electronics has really suggested to use directional mics. It'll pick up more of the sounds from your instrument and less of the background noises. Say if someone's walking into your performance, you're not going to get clack, clack of someone's high heels as you are playing this really serious, solemn piece. For me as a clarinetist, microphone placement has been a process, just finding a lot of the best things that work. For those of you who are not clarinetists or woodwind players, people tend to find, or they tend to guess rather, that the sound comes out here. However, with clarinet, you have all of these tone holes up and down the instrument, and the sound comes from each of these tone holes. So say I have maybe these two fingers down, the back thumb and the pointer finger. Your sound's going to come out at this area. So if you have it mic'd right here, it's not going to catch as much of that sound. Whereas having it at the bottom, you're catching some of the lower notes by having it at the bottom, but it's also pointing up to catch some of these higher notes as well. For each instrument, it's going to be different, so definitely take some time out of your hard and heavy practice routine and just work with that microphone placement and see what works best for your instrument or for your voice. One thing that has been super helpful, make a friend in an audio engineer or otherwise tech-savvy person. So Dan in the back has been my saving grace for pretty much this entire recital and just has been awesome at troubleshooting. And I've been asking for his help before the performance, just getting a dress rehearsal in and making sure all of my technology works. He is helping during, making sure that things continue to work, and also after, for a lot of the aftercare of the equipment. And audio engineers, as just a general note, it is literally their job to know everything that you're potentially wanting to do with electronics. So if you're doing it, chances are they know how to help. One other important thing to know, and I find this especially for fixed electronics, is consider using a monitor, such as the one down here in your performance. I find sometimes when I'm performing, because you as the audience, you're obviously the ones listening to this, speakers are pointing that way, but I'm not in front of them. I tend to stand at their level or behind, so that means that maybe there are some things in the backing track in which, a very subtle cue I might end up missing if I don't have a really good audio source really close to me. Having a monitor either on the ground, or if you're feeling fancy, you can use in-ear monitors, so basically headphones with the output going right to your ears. That will help you catch up a few of those things that you might otherwise miss. Now, the last thing to worry about with fixed electronics especially is, do you want to amplify your instrument, or are you going to leave it unmiked? Always come prepared to mic if you're going to a new place. But maybe if you are I know I've played in roomy spaces like this before, and I have found myself not necessarily needing to mic my instrument, So your venue and the type of music that you are playing is going to be a really, really good guide for you to figure out if you want to mic that instrument or not. Does anyone have any questions at this point? All right, well, we're done with our performance on this. That's awesome, that's great. Now what? Well, there are a lot of people who have worked with electronics in really, really cool ways, and I've given you all a list of that. So I'm not going to talk about every single person on this list, although every single person is absolutely worth looking up and seeing just a lot of the cool stuff that they have done. But I'm going to highlight just a few of my personal favorites. First up, has anyone heard of Kishibashi before? Oh, one person, awesome. So Kishibashi is a singer-songwriter, and he works with loop pedals for the most part, maybe with a couple of different effects. But he also plays violin and will loop that violin, maybe changing the octave placement up and the speed as well during his performances. And it just creates this really cool aural effect. I've got an example to play for you all now so you can hear what I'm talking about. So you can hear some of where the layering happens at the beginning, and then some of the octave displacement, and then he, comes in with his own vocals and violin at that normal speed. So the next person I would like to highlight is Wendy Carlos. So she actually is pretty famous in just kind of big Hollywood world. She's written a lot of really famous soundtracks, such as Tron, as well as a couple of others that I can't remember at this point. But in 1968, she was working with Robert Moog, so the Moog synthesizer was just becoming a new thing. They were working on development. And she actually popularized the use of that instrument through an album called Switched on Bach. What this is a whole collection of Bach works, but it's played on synthesizer. So I see a couple of people in the back know exactly what I'm talking about. Now, unfortunately, a lot of this audio has been really hard for me to find in preparation for this presentation. But fortunately, a lot of people on YouTube have made tributes to her and her works with this synthesizer. So I will play you one of the examples of one of the tribute Bach pieces. So remember, this is 1968. This is before all those hair bands with all these synthesizers happened in the 80s. So this was an absolutely mind-blowing concept. The next composer I would like to highlight is Steve Reich. So he's one of my favorite classical composers, and he's been one of those people working with electronics since about the 1960s or so. One of his most landmark pieces is called It's Gonna Rain. And so what he does in this piece is he actually has recorded audio from a preacher in New York where he's talking about Book of Revelations or some other biblical passage, and he's going, "It's gonna rain," as part of his really Reich takes this recording and he actually has two tape decks. One of them is playing at normal speed, but one of them is at a slightly different speed, very, very minimal, and it pulls away and pushes back in and creates this really echoey effect. Now, in terms of incorporating classical instruments, live instruments, he takes a very similar concept, using that audio of people, and puts it into this one piece, different trains. What he does is he takes interviews of Holocaust survivors, as well as people who took public transit during the time of World War II, and also some other train noises and very related audio, and creates a composition for fixed electronics, using those sounds and combining it with a string quartet. For a lot of his later works at this point, but Different Trains happens to be one of my personal favorites, which is why it's the example. The last artist that I would like to highlight is probably in my top 3 favorite musical artists of all time, and that is Sufjan Stevens. Has anyone heard of Sufjan Stevens before? Excellent, good taste in music right there. Awesome. So Sufjan, most of his body of work is actually very folk, very acoustic inspired, especially his most recent album in, I believe, 2015, Carry and Gold. But he also has worked with electronics in the past as well. And his most recent work with a lot of electronic backings is Age of Odds, spelled A-D-Z. And in this, he actually combines a lot of electronic synthesized noises and has this symphonic soundscape that runs all throughout the whole album. So using strings, using woodwinds, using brass at a lot of different points to create a really dramatic effect. This track I'm going to play for you displays all of that, and it is called Too Much. So as you can see, there are a lot of artists out there that are really worth checking out if you just need a jumping spot to start with, well, what is there out there? What can I do with electronics? Right, why let all these composers have the fun when you, any one of you in the audience, can be doing the same thing? I was talking to a couple of people in the audience before, like, But with this handout, you have at least a good foundational knowledge of just what you would need in order to execute any idea that you would have. I've actually started writing a lot of original electronic music within the last year and a half or so, and it's been truly rewarding. I've even gotten to explore a lot of skill sets, even outside of electronics as a general medium, such as songwriting, lyric writing, just performing in public, and different things like open mics or other unconventional performance spaces. And I feel like I have grown so much as a musician because of it. If you're looking for another way to start, maybe just choosing one type of electronics, whether it's just a simple delay pedal, a loop pedal, playing clarinet karaoke, just figuring out what to do, and maybe just improvising over stuff. Just wondering, hey, what does this effect on this pedal do? What happens if I even play something as simple as a C major scale? Some of the results are going to be really surprising and just maybe not what you've expected. And practice makes music at the end of the day. So you may not always like what comes out of your electronics effect or whatever you're trying to experiment with. But that's really okay, and honestly, it's part of the process. Learning what you like to do, learning what you don't like to do in music is going to help you figure out where your niche is and what kind of things that you really feel comfortable and really enjoy doing. And I think at the end of the day, that's really what it's all about. It is really worth it. Does anyone have any questions at this point before the last part of this presentation? All right, well, I'm going to end this lecture with one of my original tunes. It's kind of a cumulation of, well, what happens when you take this handout into context? This piece is really special to me as it's one of the first ones that I've ever written, and it's called Of the Wind. Thank you so much for your time, everybody.